Donald Trump just ordered the most aggressive trade strike against an allied nation in modern American history. At 9:14 a.m. Eastern this morning, the White House released an emergency declaration through the Office of the United States Trade Representative imposing tariffs of 35% on Canadian manufactured automobiles and 25% on Canadian lumber and agricultural products, and a blanket 15% on all remaining Canadian imports. Effective in 72 hours. The stated justification: systemic currency manipulation and non-reciprocal trade practices, and the actual effect: a declaration of economic war against America's single largest trading partner, the country that buys more American exports than China, Mexico, and Japan combined. And Prime Minister Mark Carney did not wait for the news cycle to turn over before responding. Within 14 minutes of the USTR announcement, Ottawa released a formal counter-declaration dollar-for-dollar retaliatory measures, a legal challenge filed under the very trade agreement this administration negotiated in its first term, and language so direct that veteran diplomats are struggling to find a historical comparison. When the leader of America's most deeply integrated economic partner responds to an emergency tariff order in 14 minutes, with a legal filing and a counterstrike, you are not watching a trade dispute. You are watching the opening move of something far larger. Hit that subscribe button right now because you won't want to miss any of the videos I release. So what exactly set off this extraordinary sequence of events, and why are economists who have spent careers studying the U.S. and Canada relationship describing what happened this morning as categorically different from every prior bilateral dispute? The USTR announcement did not arrive without warning. Tensions had been building since January through disputes over softwood lumber quotas, dairy market access, and a series of escalating White House social media posts accusing Canada of systematically cheating American workers. In February, the administration announced a preliminary 10% tariff on Canadian steel, describing it at the time as a down payment on broader action. Canada's trade minister immediately convened an emergency session of the Canada-US Trade Council and issued a public warning that Ottawa was prepared to respond with full force. The White House read that warning as a bluff. According to 3 sources familiar with internal deliberations, a senior trade advisor briefed the president in late February and told him directly that Canada's deep economic dependence on the American market made serious retaliation structurally unlikely. That assessment, as the events of this morning have made clear, was wrong in every meaningful respect. Smash that like button if this is making sense so far. Here is the full picture of what makes this morning's announcement different from every prior trade action in the bilateral relationship. Canada and the United States conduct approximately $900 billion in two-way trade annually. Canada is America's single largest export market, larger than China, larger than Mexico, larger than the entire European Union combined. More than 8 million American jobs are directly tied to that relationship, and the auto sector alone involves a level of integration so deep that individual vehicle components across the Canada-US border an average of 7 times during the manufacturing process before a finished car leaves the assembly line. The tariffs announced this morning do not redirect that supply chain. They tax it at every crossing. Every 35% tariff on a Canadian-made auto part is, in economic practice, a 35% surcharge on American assembly. That is not a partisan characterization. It is the unanimous conclusion of the Anderson Economic Group, the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, all of which issued statements of alarm before noon, when organizations that have consistently supported this administration's broader trade agenda describe an emergency tariff order as a threat to American manufacturing. It signals that the economics are genuinely alarming in ways that go well beyond political positioning. Here's where it really gets serious. When Carney's 14-minute response landed in Washington, it landed as something more consequential than a diplomatic objection, according to reporting from the Globe and Mail, confirmed by a source briefed on cabinet deliberations. Canada had been preparing formal contingency response packages for 3 distinct tariff scenarios since early February. The scenario that most closely matched this morning's announcement had been fully drafted and reviewed. The response package that Carney released contained 3 elements: dollar-for-dollar retaliatory measures targeting American soybeans, pork, corn, wheat, steel, and aluminum products grown and manufactured predominantly in states that voted for this administration. A formal challenge filed under CUSMA Article 32.10, the provision specifically designed to prevent emergency tariff impositions without demonstrated legal justification, and a statement characterizing the tariff order as unlawful under the terms of QSMA, incompatible with WTO obligations, and contrary to the basic principle of sovereign equality among trading nations. Canada did not improvise that response in 14 minutes. Canada had it prepared. And the preparation tells you something important about how seriously Ottawa assessed the risk of this moment and how disciplined its response was designed to be. Here's what multiple sources say happened in Washington in the hours that followed. Wall Street delivered its verdict by 11:30 a.m. The S&P 500 fell 1.8%. Ford dropped 3.4%. General Motors declined 4.1%. Bond markets began pricing in a higher probability of recession. And the auto sector's reaction was not sentiment-driven. It was operational. A senior official at the Alliance for Automotive Innovation told Reuters that roughly 40% of components used in American-assembled vehicles either originate in Canada or pass through Canadian infrastructure from Mexico. A 35% tariff on those components does not hurt Canada. It shuts down American assembly lines. By noon, Republican senators from states most exposed to the economic fallout had begun breaking cover. Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska cited threats to Alaskan energy export agreements with Canadian infrastructure partners. Senator Tom Tillis of North Carolina raised concern about tobacco and agricultural exports. The fractures were appearing inside the president's own party within 3 hours of the announcement, and that speed tells you something important about the depth of the economic exposure across the Republican coalition. Drop a comment right now. If you saw this coming, I read every single one. Now things get absolutely extraordinary. At 2:45 p.m. Eastern, Prime Minister Carney held a press conference in Ottawa that was scheduled for 15 minutes and ran for 52. What he said in those 52 minutes did not sound like the language of a government seeking to de-escalate. Carney stated directly, without diplomatic hedging, that the tariffs as announced were unlawful under CUSMA, incompatible with WTO obligations, and contrary to the basic principle of sovereign equality. He then announced something that went well beyond trade law. Canada, he said, was suspending participation in 3 joint U.S.-Canada security committees, including the Cross-Border Crime Forum, pending resolution of the trade dispute. Those committees are not symbolic bodies. They coordinate real-time intelligence sharing on cross-border drug trafficking, weapons smuggling, and terrorism threats. By connecting the trade dispute to the security architecture in a single public announcement, Carney signaled that Canada was prepared to escalate across domains that the White House's tariff strategy did not appear to have modeled. That is when it became clear this confrontation had crossed into territory with no recent parallel in the bilateral relationship. This is not the first time a president has used tariffs aggressively against allied trading partners, and the historical pattern is worth understanding in detail. In 2002, President Bush imposed steel tariffs of up to 30% on European Union imports. The EU filed a WTO challenge immediately and prepared retaliatory tariffs targeting Florida citrus, Wisconsin dairy, and Michigan auto parts products chosen specifically for their political visibility in swing states. And the tariffs collapsed within 18 months when the WTO ruled against Washington and Bush rescinded them rather than absorb the retaliatory consequences. Then came the 2018 Section 232 tariffs. which targeted Canada, Mexico, and the EU simultaneously. Canada's response in 2018 was measured and retaliatory dollar-for-dollar countermeasures targeting swing state products, and those tariffs were eventually suspended as part of the USMCA renegotiation. But the critical difference between 2018 and today is the Prime Minister on the other side of the table. Mark Carney is not a figure who has staked his political identity on managing the relationship smoothly. He won his most recent mandate on the explicit premise of not backing down to American economic pressure. His domestic standing depends on holding that position. Subscribe immediately if you haven't yet. This content doesn't exist anywhere else. So what legal framework is Canada invoking, and how strong is the ground it is standing on? CUSMA Article 32.10, the provision cited in the formal challenge filed this morning, was written specifically to prevent emergency tariff impositions without demonstrated legal justification. The White House's stated basis is currency manipulation. Canada operates a floating exchange rate and has not been cited for manipulation by the IMF, the G7, or any international financial institution. Jennifer Hillman, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and former member of the WTO appellate body, told CNN this afternoon that the USTR's currency manipulation justification would not survive even a preliminary panel review under CUSMA. Former U.S. Trade Representative Michael Froman told MSNBC that the administration's legal exposure is substantial, that retaliatory measures imposed in response to an unlawful tariff order are themselves protected under international trade law, meaning Canada's countermeasures cannot be legally challenged while the underlying American tariff order remains under dispute. The legal architecture, in short, favors Ottawa. The diplomatic posture favors Ottawa, and the economic preparation, as this morning's 14-minute response made visible, also favors Ottawa. Don't go anywhere. The most explosive part is coming next, and here's what should concern every American watching this story, regardless of political affiliation. The 8 million American jobs tied to the Canada trade relationship are not statistics. They are auto workers in Michigan and Ohio whose assembly lines depend on Canadian components crossing the border multiple times per vehicle. They are farmers in Iowa and Indiana whose largest export market is Canadian consumers. They are energy workers in Alaska whose pipeline infrastructure runs through Canadian territory. They are small manufacturers across the Midwest whose supply chains were constructed around the integrated North American production model that NAFTA and CUSMA deliberately created over 30 years. A 35% tariff on Canadian goods does not bring those jobs back from Canada. There are no Canadian jobs to bring back, because the integration is bilateral and mutual. And what it does is raise the cost of the American half of a jointly constructed operation while creating the legal and diplomatic conditions under which Canada can legitimately begin redirecting its long-term trade relationships toward Europe and Asia. Canada's trade minister had already opened formal discussions with the European Union to accelerate the expansion of the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement the previous month. Ottawa is not waiting passively for this dispute to resolve. Canada is building alternative commercial architecture in parallel. This puts American businesses, and American farmers in particular, in a position from which there is no straightforward exit. The draft retaliatory list covers $28 billion in American agricultural exports to Canada annually: soybeans, pork, corn, and wheat, grown in the very states whose senators this administration cannot afford to lose. Speaking out against the tariffs publicly risks becoming a political target. Staying silent means absorbing the supply disruption and cost increases without recourse. Legal and political analysts are describing this dynamic as a trap the administration constructed for itself. Edward Alden, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and the author of the definitive scholarly study of American trade policy, told the Washington Post today that the president has created a situation where every outcome available to him is worse than not having started. Even the Wall Street Journal editorial board, which has not been quick to criticize this administration's trade instincts, warned in a piece published this afternoon that unlike tariffs on China, the Canada tariffs hit American manufacturers directly in their most vulnerable supply relationships. Do me a favor and slam that like button because it genuinely helps this video reach more people. So let's break down what this actually means across 3 dimensions that matter for the months ahead. The immediate economic impact is measurable and accelerating. The Anderson Economic Group projects that if the tariffs hold, prices on American manufactured vehicles will rise between $3,000 and $8,000 per unit within 6 months. Lumber prices will spike further, adding between $9,000 and $14,000 to the cost of a new American home at a moment when housing affordability is already at historic lows. Grocery prices will increase across dozens of categories where Canada is a primary supplier. The political impact is moving faster than the administration appears to have anticipated. Republicans in auto manufacturing states face an immediate and uncomfortable choice between defending higher car prices and potential plant shutdowns on one side and breaking with the president on the other, with primary season approaching and no clean political cover available, and the diplomatic implications extend well beyond the bilateral relationship. Every close American trading partner, the United Kingdom, Japan, the European Union, is watching this confrontation and drawing conclusions about the reliability of American trade commitments. If Canada, bound to the United States by a treaty this administration negotiated, can be treated this way, every government watching is recalculating its own exposure. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I am genuinely curious to hear your perspective. But beyond the immediate trade fallout, this confrontation is really about something foundational to American credibility in the global economic system. CUSMA, the successor to NAFTA, negotiated, signed, and ratified by this administration during its first term, contains explicit provisions governing when and how tariffs may be imposed. If those provisions can be overridden through an emergency declaration built on a legally contested currency manipulation claim, every trade agreement the United States has ever signed carries diminished binding weight. That is not a partisan observation. It is a structural observation about how international commercial frameworks function. Reports indicate that former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice's office has already been in contact with senior Canadian officials, offering informal back-channel dialogue. Meanwhile, inside the Republican caucus on Capitol Hill, a small group of senators is reportedly discussing whether to advance a resolution invoking congressional authority over trade policy, a constitutional prerogative that Congress has largely ceded to the executive branch for decades but never formally surrendered. If that group finds the votes, the administration will face a challenge from within its own institutional base that the tariff order did not account for. Things escalated further when the president responded to Carney's afternoon press conference with a series of social media posts beginning at 4:12 p.m. The post described Canada's retaliatory measures as an act of economic aggression and accused Carney of playing politics with American jobs. One post threatened to expand the tariff list to include Canadian energy exports, a threat that, if executed, would directly raise heating and electricity costs for millions of Americans in 6 northeastern states who depend on Canadian natural gas and hydroelectric power. Stay with me. What comes next will completely change how you view this situation. Here is what makes those posts more revealing than they were intended to be. Rather than addressing Canada's CUSMA challenge on its legal merits or offering a substantive justification for the currency manipulation claim, the posts attacked Carney personally and demanded that Canada come to the table immediately. But Canada had already come to a table, the CUSMA dispute panel table, where the legal process will now run its course over bonds, and within 24 hours of the confrontation beginning, Carney's approval rating jumped from 52 to 61% in a flash poll conducted by Abacus Data. When your response to a formal trade dispute is a personal attack on a foreign leader, and that leader's domestic approval rises by 9 points overnight, the attack has not worked. Legal experts flagged the deeper problem immediately, attacking the officials exercising constitutional oversight functions, while simultaneously claiming the underlying legal challenge is baseless, creates an internally inconsistent position. If the Kuzma challenge is without merit, the appropriate response is a legal brief, not a social media campaign. The defensive posture only underscores the weakness of the underlying legal foundation. This goes far beyond a single tariff order. It is about whether the United States intends to honor the terms of agreements it negotiated, and whether the leverage assumptions that underpinned this particular trade action were based on an accurate reading of Canada's political and economic resilience. If there are no consequences for imposing tariffs that challenge a treaty's explicit terms, it signals that American trade agreements carry no binding weight beyond whatever is convenient, in that the moment that precedent that carries consequences that extend far beyond this dispute and well beyond this administration. If this blows your mind, hit that like button right now. Here's the situation. An emergency tariff order targeting $900 billion in annual bilateral trade has been imposed on America's closest economic partner. Canada responded with legal action, dollar-for-dollar countermeasures, and the suspension of key security cooperation committees, all within hours of the announcement. American businesses are alarmed. American farmers are directly exposed. Republican senators in economically vulnerable states are already breaking cover, and Prime Minister Carney is operating from a position of domestic political strength, legal preparation, and strategic readiness that the White House's pre-tariff assessments failed to model. Keep a close eye on this story. The CUSMA dispute panel is expected to convene within 30 days. Congressional conversations about invoking trade oversight authority are underway. And economic impact reports from industries on both sides of the border are being prepared that will make the political costs of sustained confrontation impossible for anyone to ignore. Before we go any further, smash that subscribe button so you never miss content like this. Here is where things stand right now. The most consequential bilateral trade relationship in the world has been thrown into formal legal dispute, with retaliatory measures active on both sides, security cooperation suspended, and no negotiating framework yet agreed. American manufacturers, farmers, and consumers are in the crossfire of a confrontation with no announced off-ramp. And Canada has demonstrated within the first 14 minutes of this crisis every sign of being prepared to sustain this confrontation for as long as it takes. This is not just another news cycle that fades within the week. This is a constitutional, economic, and diplomatic crisis forming in real time, one with consequences for American treaty credibility, bilateral security architecture, and the economic well-being of millions of American workers that will not resolve themselves through social media posts or escalating threats. The evidence is on the record. The legal challenge has been filed. The retaliatory measures are in effect. Now we wait to see whether the administration can find a path to resolution before the damage becomes permanent. The stakes have never been higher. The legal exposure has never been more clearly documented. And the question of what American treaty commitments are actually worth in practice has never demanded a more urgent answer. Pause for a second and hit that like button if you are finding value in this coverage.